We're at that stage where we're actually going to have an amazing conversation with BV Jagadeesh and Praveen. Praveen and BV have known each other for many years. He's a partner and managing director at Inside Venture Partners. But yeah, instead of me butchering his introduction, I would love BV to make the introduction. And BV doesn't need much of introduction, so go ahead, BV.
Thank you, Manu. It's always a pleasure to introduce Praveen. Praveen and I go back almost 25, 28 years. When I was doing Exodus Communications, he was actually heading a group that was very crucial for us. And he built this team to support companies like Exodus and other data center companies and networking companies. And his support, especially at the time when lots of things were changing in the internet core infrastructure, having him on the other side, where they were providing all the technologies for us to build very complex infrastructure backbone, absolutely made our life a lot easier. And from then on, Praveen went on to become the general manager of Core Routing Group. I think that was worth several billions of dollars of revenues, and then later on for Edge routing as well. And then he was handpicked to become the CEO of VCE. VCE was a joint venture between VMware, Cisco, and EMC. And Praveen basically scaled that company all the way from zero to close to $2 billion. And eventually the company got acquired by EMC. And later on, he joined a startup company funded by Sequoia Capital called Viptela in the SD-WAN business. And from there, which was also almost at zero revenues, he scaled it to a significant revenue and had a very good acquisition by Cisco. So since then, he has been a VC. We've done some projects together as well. And now he is a general partner at Insight Venture Partners. So it's always a pleasure to have Praveen with us. And welcome, Praveen.
Thank you, BV. Appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Yeah, perfect. So we should jump right into it. So we're going to discuss, everybody's discussing about the bubble in AI. So rather than discussing things that you already have overheard about, let's sort of discuss about the defensibility on AI. And so maybe Praveen, a question for you. Like as you look at the agentic AI future versus the foundational models, and you've spent a lot of your work at Inside, looking at agentic AI. And we've seen a massive amounts of capital concentration in this area. And so the question is, do you believe that true enterprise value, and the resulting investment returns on all these vertically focused stuff will be captured by this agentic AI layer, or is there a future of defensibility tied to control over data, so fine-tuning, underlying infrastructure, or something else? So
yeah, I think it's interesting, as BV mentioned, he and I have been sort of co-passengers across multiple different technology transitions, right? And we worked together in the internet. We were together when we were looking at a lot of the cloud transition that was happening when I was at VCE, and he was kind of helping multiple companies. And I think one of the things that you notice through these different kind of shifts in technology is that they come in phases, right? The first phase is the infrastructure build out. And if you go back to the internet era, Cisco was kind of the Google of its time, or the OpenAI of its time, essentially defining standards, defining what that infrastructure looked like, and most of the value was captured at that layer, right, in the first phase. Then, as the internet matured and as the technology evolved, you started to see companies and businesses being built on top of the internet infrastructure, and then the value essentially started to migrate more towards those platforms and those companies, right? So the Amazons, the Googles, the Netflixes, the Ubers, etc. So I think we're kind of going through a similar phase in a much, much more accelerated fashion, I must say, in this AI transition as well. So, NVIDIA's worth 5 trillion. There's a good reason why, because it defines fundamentally the infrastructure on top of which a lot of these AI models as well as companies are being built. And I think you're starting to see also value accrue into these foundation models, which are now kind of central to all these, the transformation that's happening in the enterprise applications. And so as this sort of progresses, we're starting to see the investment starting to shift more towards agentic AI companies. I mean, clearly there's still billions and billions of dollars going into the foundation model companies. We were investors in the last Anthropic round at Insight, and you saw OpenAI continues to raise more capital as they try to sort of figure out the next iteration of these foundation models. But from a venture perspective, you're starting to see tremendous amount of investment into these kind of agentic companies, if you will. So I'll pause here and maybe get BV your perspective in terms of what you're seeing, because and then we can kind of go into defensibility, which is another kind of interesting question that we probably should.
Yeah. So the way I look at, right, if you go back and look at the history, as you rightly said, first you build the infrastructure, which is the most important thing. And it took a while for the infrastructure to be built because you need to almost get to a stage where it's like electricity, right? You turn on the switch and electricity always comes. So back in mid 90s to early 2000, that was not the case with internet. Internet was still unstable. It was performance challenges. It was reliability challenges, all of those things. But today, you can almost say that we have reached a stage where you turn on the switch and internet starts work. And there's so many things that either at home or work, we depend so much on the internet to be working all the time. And I think the AI models need to get to that stage where people can trust the model that, hey, this answer is it trustworthy or not trustworthy? Because I don't think we are there yet at this point of time. And that's the reason as to why you're seeing all this massive investment. And, if you hear OpenAI, they talk about $1 trillion of investment in computing power. I mean, that's the only way you can really get to a stage where every use case, people will start trusting the base model. And then, like in internet, right, lots of applications, whether it's on the consumer side or on the enterprise side, which is, I think, where the big money to be made and a lot more companies can be born to solve some basic problems, for the enterprise and for consumers. And we don't even know what other applications are going to open up at this point of time, given this whole AI being so new. So I think it's going to be pretty fascinating to see what is in the future, especially for applications built on top of these models.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because one of the first questions I always ask when I'm talking to, founder who's building something in the agentic space is, what is your definition of an agent? Right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
there's a whole spectrum of how you talk about or you think about what an AI agent actually is, right? The classical sort of academic definition is, software that's able to take action on its own by using tools, right? That's sort of the academic definition. And, various different iterations of that, you can hear when you talk to different companies. But, I think the way I think about it, because it's a question about like, what is a kind of defensible AI agent, right? In a sense, what you're seeing right now is every single sort of vertical application or a functional software, right? Like a marketing software, HR software, legal software, or a supply chain or a healthcare workflow. All of these are being sort of agentified, if you will. So what that means to me really is that you're going from these kind of statically defined, deterministic software programs, which were essentially the applications, to something that is essentially now more dynamic and more sort of interactive, if you will, being able to adapt to the business environment in real time and being able to sort of build on top of that, right? Value. So that transition from like static, fixed to a dynamic, engaged, interactive mode is essentially that transition that we all feel. I mean, you can see it from search to ChatGPT, right? Search gives you 10 blue links. ChatGPT allows you to ask questions and be more interactive. So in a ways, I think that's really that transition that's now we're seeing across consumer as well as enterprise apps. And the AI itself is actually a component of the actual software, right? In the first phase, we saw a lot of agentic companies essentially, a user interface wrapped around a model. And those ended up not being very defensible because effectively the model over a period of time, evolved to the point where the user interface became, not really that interesting. So now what you're seeing is that more sophisticated founders are using AI where it makes the most sense. Where, for example, you're ingesting a lot of data and you're trying to kind of make sense out of that data, or you are effectively have to respond to a user's, you've added a new SKU or you need a new piece of data. And now the software has the ability to use web search or different tools to go get that information in real time and incorporate it into the workflow, right? And it also has the ability to improve itself based on the user feedback. So that, that sort of ability to insert AI in the software where it makes the most sense, essentially, I think is how you build defensibility. Yes, data is important. Yes, obviously the core algorithm is important, right? But fundamentally, I think the question you need to ask is, where does AI make the most sense? And how do I build something that can give me the same determinism as SaaS, incorporating AI, right?
So with that in mind, if you look at some of the early successes of AI applications like a Cursor or Lovable, or some of these things, and in fact we have a company that has scaled in a span of just 18 months close to like $15-20 million in revenue from zero revenue, which is pretty impressive, right? I mean, that's essentially what we're seeing with Cursor and all that. So the question to you especially is that do you think that is going to be the bigger trend where companies don't actually need the later stage investments at all?
Yeah, no, that's kind of an interesting question, right? Because I think, it's clear that an AI native company is a different archetype than a SaaS company, right? We talked about sort of from in the guts of the software, what that means. But if you're going to elevate for a second, this question around, this rapid scale that you're seeing or the efficiency that you're seeing, I think there are two aspects to this, right? Because it's also important to understand that not all AI native companies are going to have this kind of like crazy growth curve that ChatGPT has or Cursor has. As always, like I think, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, these AI native companies stand on the shoulders of multiple different layers of infrastructure that exist today, right? So everybody has access to, let's take Cursor. Everybody uses VS Code. It's a very familiar IDE, right? Every developer uses VS Code. You and I maybe coded in like, Emacs and VI and these kind of, editors. But today, VS Code is sort of one of the standard open source IDEs. So what Cursor essentially did was took something that every developer used and fundamentally made that experience much better with AI, right? Marrying code generation with an open source IDE that everybody understood. And on top of that, building value, right? Things like planning, things like, macros, like being able to save your work, understanding context, having memory. So it made the whole developer experience better. And so that adoption curve you saw was primarily because you're not asking the developers to learn something or do something fundamentally different. You're just taking their workflow and dramatically accelerating it by using AI with essentially the developer in control, right? So I think a lot of times, we all talk about, maybe we've seen multiple different companies, right? What accelerates the growth curve of a company is how much friction there is for the user to adopt that particular product. ChatGPT grew like that because all you needed to do was to go to a website and type something, right? Any individual who has basically been using a computer or a mobile phone knows how to do that, right? There's no real training required for you to understand how to use ChatGPT. Similarly, for Cursor, from a developer perspective, it is VS Code, right? With all this kind of value-added code generation capability, all these tools and frameworks around it. And that's the reason why. So the lesson to learn for us as we're looking at all these AI native companies is Not that they all will have the same growth curve, but like, the question to ask is how much friction are we expecting for the end user, right, to experience when they're adopting this from whatever it is that they're using today? When they go to the AI native software, how much friction is there? The less of the friction, I think, the more steeper the growth curve.
Perfect. I think we've covered so many amazing parts. I mean, I think defining what an AI native company does, the capital efficiency of these companies, this is the dichotomy, right? You have the foundational models that are taking hundreds of billions of dollars, and you have the applications or the layer companies actually, being able to scale with less, right? So I think it'll be very interesting to sort of see how this continues to sort of scale up. But you know, the other part is that as you sort of the DNA, what it requires to be able to go from 0 to 100, 100 to a billion, and so on. And I think you two are the perfect people for this because BV, you scaled Exodus from 0 to 5 billion in revenue in a few years, and Praveen, same with you, taking VC to $2 billion in revenue in a short amount of time. And I've had experience at Google having a few hundred million to tens of billions, right? But yes, I would love for the audience here, the LPs and the founders in the audience, to sort of understanding building to scale. What are some of the learnings on these types of massive sort of hyperscaling? And are the new generation AI companies doing anything differently, or is it an old wine, a new wine bottle?
Hmm. Well, I think this is a very important question, especially for an entrepreneur and for an investor to look at it, right, where to put the money into. So apart from the standard things that a company has to do, which is building systems and processes, and all of those things are extremely important, right, from a scaling point of view and predictability of your business, both from revenue point of view and from expense point of view and from on-time product delivery point of view, right? A lot of these things, it's very important to build the right kind of systems in place. But the two things that I sort of emphasize the entrepreneurs is that number one is once you have acquired a customer, what does it take for you to increase the ASP per customer? And that requires, proliferation of your product to larger audience within the organization. That's one aspect of it. The second is for the same company, what other products adjacent to what you're selling, right, is something that me as a company, I should be looking at. Is that something that I need to develop internally myself so that I can sell more products to this customer? Or should I be acquiring those from outside and integrate that into my system so that my ASP per customer is continuously increasing? So which means I need to be making the right set of investments, right? To constantly be thinking that it's not that this one product that I have sold is the end of selling to this customer. So I think that's a very important thing. The second that one needs to be thinking is at any point of time, you should be looking at your exec staff to see how many of these people are willing to scale to the next level. Are these people ready to go from 10 to $100 million, or 100 to $500 million, or 500 to $1 billion and above? And I can tell you based on my own experience, and this is a question, by the way, you need to ask even yourself as well as a founder, right? Are you the right person to scale this? And I can tell you that not everybody can scale to the next level. So in which case you need to be making the right changes. And I think these two are very important factors that entrepreneurs and investors should be looking at very carefully as to how you scale the organization to the next level.
Yeah.
So Praveen, I would love to sort of, I know, so that's the strategic side of things. I think the personality of the human being, the founder, the personality traits, some of and then also founders who like, hey, because the foundational models are changing so much, maybe I should sell my company. And I think some founders end up selling their companies too soon as well. So what is it about the personality traits that you look for in a founder?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because in some ways, you know, starting a company, building a company is a deeply, deeply kind of personal commitment, right? It's these startups are essentially the babies of a lot of these founders, and so there's like a deep emotional connection with the company. And I think what we typically look for from a founder perspective is really sort of you know the notion of like, why is this founder the right person to go solve this problem, right? um, and it doesn't mean that they need to have deep expertise in certain areas. We just funded a company, 21-year-olds out of MIT building in the compliance space, right? So it's not that you need to be like a 10-year veteran in a particular domain space. That's not what we look for. But essentially what we look for is can they bring together an understanding of the problem space and a fundamentally different approach, right? That we think can essentially, as we talked about, like reduce the friction for the customers, so they will adopt this product faster than they've been adopting, the existing software that they're using. So I think it's really that core, and you only get that. I mean, it's you probably have a much more fine-grained view of this as seed investors, but for us as sort of Series A investors, we have a little bit more signal than you do, right? In terms of the ability for us to be able to speak to some of the early customers and understand how how the customers talk to us about the product, right, and their experience. And that tends to be a big the data point for us. So you talk about the founders, you talk about sort of the customer adoption and the customer perception. I think the third thing really is sort of, we were talking about this a bit earlier as well. This kind of what I call the systems engineers mindset, right? Today, when you're building an AI native company, effectively what you're doing is you're bringing together multiple different, components or kind of key technologies, if you will. There's a data layer, there's a foundation model layer, there's a user interface, there's tools, right? There's evals and observability, there's security, right? And so in order for you to build a successful AI native company, you want a founder that kind of brings the systems engineering mindset of being able to put these pieces together in order for them to deliver an amazing experience for the end user, right? So while, again, to go back to our example of Cursor that B.V. was mentioning, it consists of multiple different moving parts that the team has done a phenomenal job of really meeting the developer where they are in VS Code, at the same time kind of bringing them the AI tools, bringing them the foundation models, bringing them things like infrastructural things like memory and context, so they can actually use these things and accelerate their workflow, right? So that systems engineering mindset, I think, is fundamentally important. And the last piece, I think, is the commercial aspect of things. We all know from having built companies, built products, that it's really not about the technology, right? Sometimes you're always surprised, like, wow, this is not the best technology company, but somehow it is the market leader, and that has a lot to do with identifying the right customers, being able to kind of have the right go-to-market strategy, and as BB mentioned, like the hunting and the farming, like go out and find new customers, but also make sure that you are increasing the value of each customer, right? So that is a very important strategy, and you want to all see a little bit of that commercial mindset in the founder when you're doing your work, right? Because you want to know that, yes, they can build an amazing product, they understand the market, but they also have that sort of hunger, right, and that edge, if you will, to be able to go out and build something unique.
So there's one thing I noticed as the three of us were speaking, that we all have a skin tone that tells us we're all from India, right? So we can't have this conversation without bringing India into the picture. So, India has been a pretty strong partner with the tech revolution, having provided the people infrastructure to play. So sort of thinking about both of us, all three of us sort of discuss this point, but the India's AI opportunity and the vantage point, having built the previous generation as well. So what do you see in terms of the opportunities and where the bloodbath will also happen as well?
So going back to the fundamental of the importance of the AI in India, right, is you go back and look at where is the data that is available? And the number one thing that I see where there is massive amount of data that is not only applicable for just India, but also for the global market is the healthcare related data. Because India is about 1.4, 1.5 billion people, and there are hundreds and thousands of hospitals and patients. I've seen plenty of these hospitals. They're packed all the time. So the amount of data that has been gathered over the last 20, 25 years, and on a daily basis, the amount of data that is being gathered, if only we can take that data and translate that into meaningful use cases, right? That helps the doctors, that helps the hospitals, that helps the patients in many, many ways. I see that as a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. So this is, you can build a not only India-centric company, but as a global company, and I can see multiple companies coming out of India. So obviously, there are other areas like supply chain and many other things that companies are evolving as well. Apart from India itself, in the retail space, I mean, as we have seen, there are plenty of companies that have done extremely well in a very short span of time. And given the openness of the public markets, many of these companies have been very successful going public in India as well for the consumer part of it. So, Praveen, what are you seeing?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellently made point, right? For me, it's really three things about India, which has sort of always been consistent, right? The first, I think, is you have a user base, that's extremely tech savvy and very fast to adopt technologies. So if you look at kind of like ChatGPT, Perplexity, any of these like consumer AI app or even open source adoption, India tends to be almost a quarter of the traffic, right, to all of these kind of AI tools, because that adoption curve is extremely fast. Second, I think is the BPO space obviously is kind of facing a little bit of sort of a kind of a moment of clarity, if you will, where they either have to transform dramatically, right, or they will be subsumed by the next wave of technology. And I think we see at least a lot of these BPOs actively collaborating with very early stage startups in the US, right? So a couple of my investments as well, like Crew AI, where they're trying to incorporate these technologies and kind of transform the way they deliver these services. Because I think all said and done, the BPOs do have a fundamental advantage. They understand how an enterprise is built globally, right? I still remember, like a CEO at VCE, we were having meetings in Sweden and Stockholm with with I think IKEA or Volvo, one of the big Swedish companies. And the person driving that whole conversation was a gentleman from TCS, right? So because they were defining that entire enterprise architecture. So that understanding of how an enterprise works, it resides within a lot of these BPOs. So now the challenge for them is, can they take that information married with the AI and reinvent themselves, right? And I think the third aspect of this is India, as B was saying itself, is like a massive market, right? And some of the companies servicing this market, like if you take a look at some of these large consumer companies like a Swiggy or Ola, or whatever, their tech stack is as sophisticated as any other tech stack that you would find like in the San Francisco Bay Area, right? So they are at the bleeding edge because they have to compete. It's an incredibly competitive market and they have to compete. So I think you have a market that fundamentally has some pretty positive signs to it. Now, I think the issue again is that, do they have appropriate access to GPUs? And it's great that BV's the company BV mentioned is actually facilitating that, right? And do they have the ability to kind of move fast, right, and be able to transform? So overall, I think the long horizon, I am bullish about India, primarily because of these factors, and I think that there are a lot of systemic issues. Now, not to kind of sugarcoat some of the things that India needs to go fix, right? Still infrastructure, the quality of some of the engineering talent that comes out, right? There's a lot of things that, some of the regulations around startups, right? All these things that still need to be addressed. But overall, I think it's, more positive, right, from my perspective.
Perfect. Yeah. So one of the things I think we talked about earlier was, there's a cultural impact and impediment from AI adoption, right? So, maybe Praveen, if you want to touch upon that a little bit more, and then we can sort of get into some of the other parts.
Yeah, I mean, look, culture is fundamental, right, for any company. Again, you talk to someone like BV who's built a startup from scratch, right? It's really all about defining that culture. Now, I think with AI, as with any new technology, right, when you're introducing new technology into a workplace, it's really important for you to be able to sort of contextualize that, right? Um, and so I think I'll put culture into two pieces. One is, what is the culture that you need to make AI successful? We talked a little bit about that from a startup perspective, like, systems engineering thinking, right, being able to be commercial, et cetera, reducing friction, right, these things, being very close to the customer. I think those are cultural attributes we look for in a startup, right? In order for AI to be able to sort of be successful in the enterprise, one of the things you always often hear from enterprises, like, the challenge is getting our teams to adopt this at scale, right? And there's this sort of distribution. Some users adopt AI, are very productive. Other users, just kind of getting started. Other users dragging their feet, right? You need everybody to go together, and that part of that is, I think, we as an AI industry, if you will, need to do a better job of positioning AI as not sort of something that's going to kill everybody's job and make everybody go to the beach, but is something that's actually going to be a productivity tool to help companies, individuals get better at what they do. So we're still at the phase, and so you see this notion of forward deployed engineers, like in a lot of these AI companies, and that's actually a proxy for reducing the friction of getting that product into the customer. A forward deployed engineer is nothing more than somebody who can actually take the product and implement it in the customer site, so the customer doesn't have to go through like a 6-month process of getting it stood up. So I think we have creative ways of solving that onboarding problem, but a big part of that is also sort of make sure that you're educating the end user and contextualizing AI appropriately.
Well, I mean, it's no surprise that Silicon Valley always sort of gets ahead of itself, with the bubble creation, and sort of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy often, but it takes many, many more years for things to sort of, spread through the enterprise. Somebody sitting in Ohio or Stockholm or Bangalore, they're not at the same level of speed, and they want to make sure that mission critical things are getting done properly and somebody understands how to do that, right? So I think so this has been a fascinating conversation. I know we can probably talk for 2 more hours, but it's one thing, deadlines and time. We only had half an hour of conversation. But before we sort of say goodbye to you, Praveen, I was thinking about us taking bets. If you were to look at the 2030 portfolio marker, what are some of the if you were to talk again in 5 years, if you were to review the top performing fund returns, what would the single common investment characteristic, whether it's technology, market, or business model, that we will all agree that sort of separated the 100x winners from the 1 or 2x, sort of winners in this new AI cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, right? And we do have the benefit of hindsight when we look back at some of those kind of 100x returners in the past, and most of them tend to be like category creators, right? Inventing a brand new category. Now, Google basically, while there was like multiple different search engines, Google effectively created sort of this model of search tied to ad, right, to be able to kind of monetize the internet, right, and make a lot of internet services free for a cost of giving your information up. Similarly, you look at something like Amazon, fundamentally it created a category of online shopping. So at a very high level, I think category creators in large markets are the ones that will drive a 100x return, right? And so you're always kind of in the hunt for those kind of unique companies. But at the same time, I think they're also it's really about sort of how much you can you shift the value equation, right? And when I kind of think about this notion of sort of why are we all so excited about agentic AI, generative AI, et cetera, right? Because I think you can now look at this piece of technology and say, like, it's not about just executing a particular task, right? It's actually about making a workflow much, much more simpler by absorbing a lot of the human, redundant work, right, into the software itself. So that kind of the amount of value you're able to kind of deliver by accelerating, a company's speed to whatever it is that they're doing, right? Speed to product, speed to customer. I think those kind of companies in large markets essentially end up creating, massive returns. The ones that are more sort of niche, or you see a lot of these, like, for example, like now you have this sort of tool chain where you have an AI tool for data ingest, you have an AI tool for integrations, you have an AI tool for observability, you have an AI tool for routing. Like all of these companies that are being created in the early stages eventually at some point have to kind of come together into some kind of a broader platform, which then potentially provides you a greater return. So you want to sort of contextualize the innovation with the scope of the value that they're creating, right? And that's sort of maybe how you would, take a chance at like trying to predict, right? If we all could predict who the 100x winners were, I'm sure, we're all retired.
Well,
Yeah.
well, BV, any thoughts on BV's retired so many times. He keeps loving doing this, so I don't know if that changes.
No, so I always like to go back to history, and I ask this question to myself so many times. If someone had asked me in the mid of 90s when we were building the internet infrastructure, right? Could you imagine a day where pretty much the entire world is going to be dependent on someone like an Amazon delivering everything that you want? Could we have even imagined to say yes to that question? Could we have imagined that the so-called blockbuster that we were all used to at one point of time, right? Going on a Friday evening and renting the movies and all of that, that whole market is going to be transitioned into completely online streaming and all of those things. I don't think anybody could have even visualized use cases and applications like this would ever come out based on this whole internet as a backbone. And I like the way I think Praveen answered, right? So we as investors today or entrepreneurs, we should be looking at, what are the new category creators that could make a much bigger impact, and where do you make those investments? And as an entrepreneur, are those the ideas that would translate into these big opportunities? And I personally think that the biggest value creation is going to be in applications. And we may not have even seen some of these applications beyond code writing and chat and some of these things that has evolved, which I think is very basic, but there's a lot more that will be happening. But as an investor, we should be uh, still applying the fundamentals in our decision making capability as we are investing, rather than being like a herd mentality, right? Just chasing the hype and then making wrong investments. And that's not a sustainable thing. So I fundamentally believe that these are the things that will create the next generation of amazing companies. But we need to apply the discipline to make these entrepreneurs to be successful.
So Praveen, well, BV, Raju, Kanwal, John, and I, we'll promise that we'll continue to sort of create these category builders and send them upstream to you. But if nothing else, hopefully one of these 10 companies that are presenting today, hopefully one of them sort of builds that mark as well. But this has absolutely been fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much more when I sort of get involved with these things, and wish you the very best. And hopefully you can stay on and listen to some more presentations as well.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for
Thank you.
having me.
Thank you.